The sun hung heavy over the dry New Mexico sky, a cruel burning orb that baked the land into cracked earth and dust that clung to every boot heel, every horse's flank, every splinter of wood on the old fence line, and Caleb Warren's lungs burned as he pulled the reins of his chestnut mare, sweat dripping down the lines of his weathered face, his eyes squinting against the glare, searching the horizon, because he had heard something, a cry, faint, broken, almost like the wind whispering, against the prairie grass, but enough to freeze his gut and make him reach instinctively toward the rifle slung at his saddle, though he didn't pull it free, not yet, because there was something in that voice that wasn't a threat but desperation, the kind of desperation he knew too well from the war and the years after, when he had watched his wife cough herself to death and his farm rot beneath a sky that never gave rain. And as he urged the mare forward, he saw her, at first just a shape on the ground beside the old stone well, a bundle wrapped in ragged cloth. But as he drew nearer, his heart gave a lurch, because the bundle moved, a hand weakly clawing at the dust, fingers trembling like brittle twigs, and then a face turned toward him, a woman's face, smeared with blood and dirt, eyes glazed with fear, lips cracked and raw as she mouthed words he could barely hear, but somehow felt like a knife. In his chest, "Please, don't touch me," and Caleb slid off the mare in a cloud of dust, boots hitting the ground heavy, hands raised not in threat, but in a strange helplessness, because he had seen broken bodies before, but never like this, never with a voice that still clung to life even as the body tried to give up. And he knelt, close enough to see her wounds, the blanket half hanging from her frail frame, her bare shoulder gashed and streaked with dried blood, her legs bruised purple and brown, one thigh still bleeding where crimson seeped into the coarse wool of the blanket. And Caleb swallowed hard, his mouth dry, because every instinct screamed to lift her, to carry her back to his ranch house, to clean the blood and give her water. Yet those words echoed, "Don't touch me," and so he crouched there in the dust, his shadow falling across her as the mare whinnied behind him, restless, the prairie stretching silent except for the rasp of her breath. And he said, his voice low and rough like gravel, "Easy now. I ain't gonna hurt you." But she flinched anyway, curling tighter, pulling the blanket over herself as if it were armor, and Caleb's fists clenched, not at her but at the invisible bastards who had left her here, whoever they were, whatever cruelty they had done. And the rage simmered with the old memories of soldiers bleeding out on battlefields, of promises broken, of the emptiness that came after. And as he watched her shiver, he realized she wasn't just fighting for her body, but for her soul. Some wound deeper than the cuts and bruises, something carved into her spirit. And yet there she was, breathing, whispering, clinging to life in the dust of a forgotten well. And he knew in that moment his day, his week, maybe his whole damn life had just changed. The night had fallen heavy over the ranch, the kind of blackness that swallowed sound and bent the edges of the horizon into nothingness. The stars scattered like cold fire across the sky, and Caleb Warren sat at the edge of his porch with his rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the barn where the girl Elena, she had whispered her name, at last lay wrapped in fresh blankets, her wounds cleaned as best as he could manage with boiled water and old cloth, her breathing steadier though still shallow. And he kept hearing those words she had spoken before sleep took her, the way her voice cracked when she finally told him the marks burned into her skin were not random cuts but carved symbols, deliberate brands that belonged to a gang Caleb knew too well, the Black Vultures, men who rode the frontier like demons, leaving towns gutted and graves unmarked. Men he had once fought when they tried to rustle his cattle years back, men led by a killer named Jeb Crowley, whose cruelty was spoken of in whispers even among outlaws. And the thought of Crowley's hands on that girl made Caleb's blood boil hot as the forge in his shed. But beneath the rage was something colder, heavier, the realization that if Elena had escaped them, they would come hunting, and his ranch, already isolated, already fragile, was now a beacon for death. And yet as he stared into the dark, his mind betrayed him with images of her eyes, those wide, terrified eyes softening for just a flicker when she told him she trusted no one, not a soul, but that maybe she could trust him, because he hadn't touched her until she asked, because he listened, because he gave her water without demanding answers, And Caleb felt a strange weight in his chest, not just responsibility, but something more dangerous: hope. The kind of hope that once got him burned when he believed he could save his wife, when he believed land and hard work could make him whole again. But this girl, this broken soul with scars that whispered of hell, she stirred something he thought long dead. And as he gripped the rifle tighter, he heard it, faint at first but growing, the distant thunder of hooves across the hardpan earth, a sound carried by the wind and twisted into his bones. And he rose slowly, scanning the horizon, the stars shifting. Above, the silence of the desert broken only by that low rumble. And he knew Crowley's men were coming, and by dawn, the ranch would no longer be a sanctuary but a battleground. And the decision Caleb had avoided all these years, the choice to fight or run, to live or die for something bigger than himself, had been forced upon him once again. And the girl sleeping in his barn was not just a victim, not just a burden, she was a spark. And sparks could burn a man alive or light the fire that saves him. And as the hooves drew nearer, Caleb whispered into the night, more to himself than anyone, "Lord, help me, I ain't running this time." ****. Dawn bled slowly across the desert, painting the horizon in strokes of red and gold, the kind of morning that should have promised peace, but instead felt like the slow drawing of a blade. And Caleb Warren stood in the yard of his ranch, hat pulled low, jaw set hard, every nerve alive with the weight of what was coming. Because Elena had told him the whole of it during the night when fever broke, and her tongue loosened, her voice cracked but steady as she described the raid on her family's farm, how the black vultures rode in with torches and laughter, burning the wheat fields, dragging her kin into the dust, and how Crowley himself had marked her, not just with the hot iron, but with words she couldn't repeat. Words that made her shake and pull the blanket tighter around her shoulders. And Caleb had listened, rage burning hotter with each syllable, but he had said nothing, because what could he promise her when he wasn't sure he could even protect his own damn ranch? Yet as the morning light grew, he felt something stir, a sense of duty he thought had died years ago. And when Elena limped out of the barn to join him, wrapped in one of his late wife's dresses, awkward and loose on her thin frame, he realized this girl had already become more than a stranger. She was the reason he'd picked up his rifle with purpose, the reason he was checking the fence lines, hauling water, making ready as though preparing for a siege. And she stood there watching him, her face pale, but her eyes harder now. Not just the eyes of a victim, but of someone who wanted to fight, even if her body was too broken to carry the weight of vengeance. And Caleb felt a flicker of pride, though he covered it with gruff words, telling her she needed to rest. But she shook her head and whispered, "They won't stop, not until they find me. You don't understand, Caleb. They'll come through fire if they have to." And he did understand, maybe better than she knew, because he had seen that kind of hunger in men before. Men who only lived to destroy. And he laid a hand on the rifle slung over his shoulder and said, "Then we'll make sure they choke on dust before they take another step." And in that moment something shifted between them, an unspoken pact forged not by choice but by survival. And as the sun climbed higher, Caleb showed her how to load a revolver, his rough hands guiding hers, his voice steady, patient, even when she trembled. And she watched him as though memorizing every motion, every word. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt less like a broken widower and more like a man with a reason to fight. But the peace of that morning was shattered when the mare in the corral reared and screamed, hooves striking the air, nostrils flaring with a fear only animals sense before men did. And Caleb spun toward the ridge and saw them, black specks on the rise, dust rising behind them like smoke, the unmistakable shape of riders, maybe a dozen, maybe more. And though they were still far off, his blood turned cold because he knew who they were, knew the swagger of men who thought themselves kings of the land. And he didn't need to see Crowley's face to feel the shadow of his presence. And Elena's breath hitched beside him as she clutched the revolver, her knuckles white. And Caleb placed a steadying hand on her shoulder and said, "Inside, now." But she shook her head again, stubborn, fire in her gaze. And Caleb knew then that no matter what happened, the ranch was no longer just his home, no longer just a place to survive. The ranch had become the line in the sand, and the storm rolling toward them would either bury them in dust or carve their names into the story of the frontier forever. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk.